Dana Pham. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
You describe yourself as a professional counter-protester. What does that mean?
Well, look, anyone can rock up to a protest, especially in Sydney and Melbourne, rock up to a protest with a sign for both capital cities. I refer to both because one of them is my home, so Sydney's my home. I can't exactly speak on behalf of Melbourne, but on behalf of Sydney, it's almost like there's a protest in Sydney every weekend. Not quite. I haven't seen too many protests of late on a weekly basis in Sydney, but there's a bit of a stereotype that almost every weekend you're bound to find some protests somewhere in Sydney or Melbourne, and you're likely to, for that matter, anyone can hold a sign. Holding a protest sign is one thing, but I mean, I can hold a sign, so I can, I might as well, if I care enough about a certain cause, I'll rock up and I'll hold a counter sign, I'll counter protest, just to show that anyone can hold a sign. And they say that a protester in any given protest represents 5 or 10 other members in the community who feel the same way. Well, true, but it would be nice to see more people getting out and about protesting more regularly on a weekend, rather than leaving voting till, once every 3 years, once every 4 years at the ballot box for your local, state, federal elections. Why not be heard whenever there's a protest? And if you disagree with a protest, why not counter protest?
So what are you, like, playing devil's advocate or something?
I wouldn't play devil's advocate just for the sake of it. I would. So my more recent counter protests included one in Sydney, one in Melbourne, where her name escapes me. Actually, no, it's Posey Parker. Posey Parker came on tour, hashtag Let Women Speak, across different cities in Australia, and I went to her events in Sydney and Canberra. And basically, I was there to protest her and to protest the people protesting against her, which made me, for both events and other events, the counter-protester.
Okay, so you were protesting, you were counter-protesting transgender rights activists as well as women's rights activists?
Why not both?
Well, you're a transgender person, right? So what about the transgender protesters were you countering?
So the trans rights activists, we've seen what they're like online, and at least Sydney-wise, especially Melbourne, we've seen what they're like in Melbourne. It's almost like they're a rule unto themselves. I think I've got that phrase correct. Yes, transgender people, they're a social minority. And it's worth noting that not every trans rights activist is trans themselves. You've got, there are some trans rights activists who are naturally trans themselves, but then you've got the virtue signalers. You'll tend to find that in a lot of leftist cause these days, there's almost like street rep to virtue signaling in their world. So why not from their perspective? But either they're too, in that kind of crowd, they're either too busy virtue signaling, which doesn't help anyone, or if they're not violent, then they show signs of wanting to be violent if police weren't around. If police weren't around, they'll get it their way, which includes getting away with kicking things down, pushing people down, maybe throwing punches. The only reason we don't see them much worse than what they've put themselves on display as in recent years, or probably even longer, is if you have a police presence, especially, I'd say Victoria Police is more politicised than New South Wales Police. New South Wales Police is politicised, naturally, but it's even worse with Vic Pol. But in New South Wales, they do try to be a bit more even-handed. And if they weren't around, well, I think you saw what happened to Posey. I'm not a fan of Posey Parker, but you saw what happened to Posey Parker in New Zealand. I think she had tomato thrown at her or something rather. And as much I detest her activism, I don't endorse tomato throwing or whatever it was that happened to her. She had red stuff on her face and all that when she was in New Zealand.
Yeah, I saw the photo. Why do you think they're so violent?
It's true that for a long time, from a human history perspective, for a long time, trans people have, been a minority. You stick out like a sore thumb, you get picked on. Not so much these days, but let's go back a few decades ago, which it isn't that long ago. Oh, I know I said earlier, from a human history perspective, for a long time, well, there's evidence, for example, one Roman emperor, I think it was, who showed signs of gender dysphoria. Elagabalus, I think that was his name. And I say he because we can't actually prove that. Trans is a more recent label, but we have pretty strong evidence that trans people have been around for a very long time. But in the West, because of more rigid sex/gender segregation, trans people or people who show signs of gender nonconformity, one in that category would stick out like a sore thumb, thereby inviting violence, bigotry in different types, discrimination, you name it. And it's almost like in the last 10 years in the West, we've been trying to correct that, but we're now kind of in overcorrection mode.
Okay, yeah.
Which now requires counter correction.
Which is what
you're doing. Why not counter protest?
Yeah, okay. Why don't we start at the beginning and talk about your trans experience, and when did you realize you're transgender, and what does that sort of mean to you? It seems like it means different things to different people. What's your experience being transgender?
I knew as young as 4, I knew there was something different about me. I didn't know what it was. This is the 90s, and I had an inkling there was something different about me. I probably, when I was 6 or 7, around there, I started playing with my mother's stuff, dressing up, that kind of thing. When I was 14 in the playground, at one point, I heard one day someone in the playground throwing the word transsexual out there, which is an older term for trans people. I didn't know what it meant, but it felt like a word that spoke to me, that it could potentially describe me. Now, this is 2003. Google had only been around for about 5 or 6 years. But I did figure out that the word transsexual describes who I am. And whilst I'm happy to be described as a transsexual, even that's now seen as an outdated term. The more politically correct label for me would be trans woman, which I'm also comfortable with, or transgender woman. But yeah, when I was 4, I knew something was up. And if that 4-year-old, 5-year-old of me was brought forward to, I suppose transported is the word I'm looking for, transported to the year 2023, that label would have been, the trans label would have been slapped on me by now. And whilst that may seem concerning, well, I don't regret my gender transition to deal with my gender dysphoria, which includes medical transition, and I've had sex reassignment surgery myself. These days it's called gender confirmation surgery, which is more politically correct, but I don't exactly agree with, because it's like, I know what my gender is. Why do I need the surgery to confirm it? Because I kind of knew, well, I've always known it to begin with. I've always known it anyway. But then the argument against using the term sex reassignment surgery is, well, I'm not changing my biological sex, like I'm not changing my chromosomes, for example, but I would still say sex reassignment surgery, or SRS, is still pretty accurate as it can be in describing my experience, because I don't have any regrets. And whilst I don't have the real deal, so to speak, it feels real enough that the only regret I have is not having the surgery when I was 18. I had the surgery, early, so about 30-ish. That's when I had the surgery. I would have rather had to have it when I was 18, and I didn't start my medical transition until I was about 19, 20, 21. Started off with testosterone blockers, and eventually got onto estrogen, oral estrogen. I'm now on estrogen implants, which is healthier, so to speak. But yeah, I would have rather that all be done when I was 14. So do I feel like there's a case for children getting on puberty blockers? Yes, but it should be administered with great caution.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because it seems to be one way or the other. But then how do you know? Because you were saying you wish you had it when you were younger, but then it's like the caution is, no, let's wait till you're older. But then how does that work?
So the lazy approaches, so there's two lazy approaches. It looks something like what we see now. It's not too bad in Australia, but it's much worse in the UK and the US, or at least we perceive that to be the case, because let's face it, as Australians, we, not so much the UK, but especially the US, we tend to look to America for what's happening in America news-wise, culture-wise. I kind of find that cringe, in that it's almost like we cringe at our own culture and at our own identity as Australians. And it's kind of like, yeah, we're Australians. We really don't need to Americanize ourselves. You know, when you look at least from an Australian perspective, we tend to look at what's happening in the States, for example, when it comes to trans issues, whether it's bathrooms, women's sports, children, etc. And one of the lazy approaches, which you see in at least some jurisdictions in the US, it's very self-identification based. If a child says, "This is who I am," or we think that's what who they say they are, because that's through the lens of their parents, but then their parents are a bit dodge. It appears in some parts of America, which is kind of like, it's a country, but I kind of compare it to the European Union. It's like, which part of America we're talking about? We're talking about California, or we're talking about Texas, because they're almost like two very different states. But depending on which part of America, you see an extreme approach of, it's almost like the parents, without necessarily realizing it themselves, they're in on it without thinking to themselves, well, actually, this might be a bad idea.
You mean they're in on the kids' transition?
The train right, because they're on the train right now, and it's almost like a train can't do a U-turn. So it's almost like they just have to go along with it.
Yeah.
That could be culturally influenced. That could be peer pressure of some sort, media pressure, cultural pressure. You see inconsistent parenting approaches on this, especially in a country like the US. The other lazier approach is wait till they're 18 or wait till they're 21, because if you can't drink it till you're 18 or 21, or smoke, get a gun, drive, etc. at those ages, so why should a child transition? Well, that's because there are some trans people out there, like myself, where we transition late in life, and as it turns out, yeah, we should have done it as teenagers. But here I am, and I just have to live with this. It doesn't mean I'm okay with it, but I just have to deal with the cards I'm dealt with because my parents weren't particularly supportive when I was younger.
Dana, I'm wondering if you can tell me about your faith.
So my parents brought me up Roman Catholic. My parents are Vietnamese by background. Not so most Vietnamese people would have some sort of Buddhist / Eastern philosophy sort of background. My parents, so Vietnamese Catholics are a minority, but with a pretty long, Catholicism has a long history in Vietnam. That's worth noting. So in my teenage years, I came across a religious sister. I confided with her. That conversation didn't go well about how to deal with me being trans. I didn't find it helpful. It wasn't the worst experience. It wasn't the greatest experience. And then in terms of belief systems, I didn't know what I was for years. And then a couple of years ago, through difficulties in life, I started church shopping, looked around. A lot of it was your evangelical / charismatic type churches. Like, yes, I've been to 1 or 2 Hillsong services, but I've been to other services. I've been to other services that's of that style. And I was never satisfied. So sometime in 2020, we've all had our own experiences in how we've had to deal with the pandemic, lockdowns, working from home, etc. At some point, I had a revelation, no pun intended, that I need to look back at my roots if I want to go somewhere. So I thought, okay, let me have a look at my Catholic roots. And then because it became apparent when I think and feel Christianity, I do it in a highly intellectual way, which is why a lot of evangelical / charismatic church services, I can't do it. I kept trying, it just wasn't for me. Whereas one can have an emotional experience potentially in a Catholic mass, but the Catholic branch of Christianity is more intellectual, more philosophical. It has a much longer tradition in the Catholic Church has a much longer tradition in academia, philosophy, theology, etc. So I figured, look, I'll do a theology degree. And in 2021, I started a theology degree at the University of Notre Dame in Sydney. There's 2 main Catholic unis in Australia, Notre Dame and ACU. ACU have gotten woke, I noticed, in recent years. Notre Dame is still a traditional Catholic uni, one of the last conservative unis left in Australia, and I thought that's the one I want to go to. And it's a 12 subject degree, masters. I have 3 to go, which is my dissertation. I'll resume that next semester.
So this is all like theology and stuff. Do you have like a spiritual relationship with Jesus, or you don't believe in that?
I have an intellectual relationship with God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit.
Okay. And how does that intersect with being transgender?
So if I was to take a biblical approach, keeping things simple, I would look to the parable of the prodigal son. Or should I say the prodigal daughter? Well, look, we won't start reinterpreting the Bible in a woke way. We'll just put that to the side because that's not the point. The point is, okay, who is the prodigal son? Well, yeah, okay, the prodigal son, as implied, is a young man of some sort, but it really could apply to you, me. It could apply to anyone. Shows signs of being a sinner. Well, we're all sinners, no? And we sin in different ways. And why do people sin? Well, we're fallen. Why we're fallen? Because we have desires. Desires, generally speaking, are good, but some desires, if acted out, such as eating an apple or eating forbidden fruit, well, that opens a can of worms. So old mate, you know, I don't know, bored on a farm or what have you. Once I believe it was half of his father's inheritances, so he could indulge in his desires. And when we look at the parable of the prodigal son, it implies that he went away, spent his inheritance on what we would call victimless crimes. So he gambled. I think it was it implied he gambled, hooked up with sex workers, etc., etc. Yeah, okay, he didn't kill anyone, I don't think, or any of that more serious crimes. But a lot of it was committing the kind of sins that you and I may have committed, or we know of people who've committed them. It might be the sin, and I just put that in inverted commas to leave for debate, the sin of medically transitioning genders. Or it could be the sin of engaging in a relationship that's not necessarily for procreative purposes, etc., etc.
So you're saying it's possible that transgender could be a sin, but it doesn't.
Well, it's kind of like
we're all sinners. Kind of
like, correct, for a whole variety of complex reasons. It's kind of, I would compare it to, is it homosexuality or is it the homosexual acts that's the issue? So is gender dysphoria / being transgender the issue, or is it acting upon it, especially medically, is that the issue? But even then, the father in the parable of the prodigal son, he knew. It's so obvious because, parents know who we are as children because we're their children. Surely he knew what was coming. But he said, okay, here's half of it and off you go. So the argument that, you're this type of sinner, so therefore you don't belong in this church, or you're a bad person, or we don't want to associate with you, blah, 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 blah. You're not a real Christian, blah, 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 blah. That parable disproves that. But there's a lot of Christians out there who think they know Christianity. It's like, no. So back to the prodigal son, realizes his mistakes for the sins he's committed, and then he comes home and the father forgives, which is kind of to say God forgives. So yeah, I'm kind of I won't be politically correct. I am the prodigal son here. We know what the gender caveat here is, but we won't go there. So I've come back home. In more recent times, I haven't exactly been Roman Catholic. I've end of last year, I technically became an Anglican, and as part of the Catholic tradition of the Anglican Communion, I follow the Catholic tradition, broadly speaking. Won't get into the nuances. It's what my parents raised me with, but it's provided a way for me to connect intellectually so that I can figure out who I am, what does it mean to be trans, from a Christian perspective, what's my place in the world. And yes, we know the jealous brother who got jealous at the father, that, the prodigal son's brother was jealous that he worked so hard on the land for so long. He was so loyal to his father, to the family, and he was seeing little reward for it because he got jealous of his brother, welcomed home with open arms, even though he blew his father's inheritance, half of his father's inheritance is like an idiot, gets the nicest part of, it was a fattened calf, I believe it was, that was offered for the family to feast on, and there was the jealous brother. That parable speaks so much into all of our lives, I believe, in some way, shape or form. And, do I regret transitioning? No. But doesn't that say something in itself? Like if I'm resisting regretting because I don't want to show my vulnerabilities, such as it turned out I was wrong and I don't want to lose face over it. Well, actually, I don't have any of those feelings. Like I've had sex reassignment surgery, so pretty obvious that I should have regretted by now if it's not meant to be. So what does that tell me? It tells me that I've just had to deal with this. I've had to deal with the cards I've been dealt with in life as best as I can. But why couldn't I be Christian in other aspects of my life? Because at the end of the day, I'm still a sinner, and even the most perfect Christian, they're still a sinner. It's just that they're a type of other sinner, and they're working on that, and I'm another type of sinner where, okay, I've transitioned genders, I don't regret it. What else can I do for this world? And that's probably a more important question than, oh, Dana, you haven't detransitioned. You're not a real.
Like, how can I make someone's life better? How can I, be more generous? Well, the Bible talks about kindness, patience, blah blah blah, right? But people are all caught up about you're homosexual, you're transgender, blah blah blah. Yeah, interesting. It seems like you've been through like some reasonable sort of hardships in your life, but you have a kind of really rational perspective. I'm just wondering, like you seems like you want to have open discussion with people, and you're not easily offended. I'm wondering how you arrived at that sort of mentality.
I think I've seen too much in life, but I've seen too much in life. The kind that I've seen too much of is lots of different human perspectives. It's shown me how complex people can be, whether it's my parents who eventually had to come to grips with who I am. I have friends across the political spectrum. I'm happy. I have friends and acquaintances who, yes, they're lefties, but they're still human. I'm this, if I had to describe my social, political, religious views, I think I'd call it something like, conservative, hardline Catholic. And I know that sounds contradictory, but I just pointed out that, we're all sinners, and I'm this type of sinner. And, I'm trying to, I've had to deal with it in a certain way. But then if you kind of put that to the side, I look like this almost mega bigoted, hardline, conservative hardline Catholic. But I think that's kind of an admission that I'm complex. And if I'm complex, everyone else is complex. So how are we going to live together? We're going to have to live together somehow.
And how do we do that?
I can't get angry at others.
Okay.
I can try to have conversations where I've had to, especially about certain controversial issues, I've had to think about those issues very hard for a very long time and very deeply. So the super Catholicness is going to come out of me right now. If you were to ask me what I think about abortion and euthanasia, you are going to hear, and I won't rattle on about this, you're going to hear your typical potentially intellectual sounding evidence-based argument for a Catholic-style argument for why I draw a hard line and abortion, euthanasia. When does life start? Well, my answer to that is very simple. Life starts at conception. Is that up for negotiating? No, I'm not going to negotiate that. However, do I think we should have laws to ban abortions? No. Now, why do I think that? Because if you try to ban something that's going to happen anyway, you'll drive the issue underground, you'll get a black market, And in some ways, you'll make the issue worse. So why don't we kind of, I think John Howard used to say that his view on abortion was something like safe, legal, rare. So I have a similar view. And so, okay, that's great. So what? Well, did you know, for example, we have pregnancy crisis centres in Australia and a pregnancy crisis hotline where women who find themselves in unplanned pregnancy situations where there is a chance that they're feeling pressure from their boyfriend, from their parents, from whoever to have an abortion. We do have these pregnancy crisis centres. There are these resources available to help them. And if I was approached by a woman who found herself in a situation, say she was pressured to have an abortion, the last thing she needs to hear from me is, according to the Bible, you're a bad person. No. She needs help. She needs guidance, and I would direct her to what I think would be resources and people that would help her through what is a difficult process. But what she decides to do in the end, well, don't forget, the father in the parable of prodigal son, he knew what was coming, and yeah. So what I'm trying to say is I can have principles, I can have very strong, hardline, if you want to call it far right principles, whatever. But if I was to ram that down people's throats, I know that's not going to work. I need to be able to show a level of practical Christianity, practical charity, I should say. That wasn't a Freudian slip. Practical Christianity. And you look at the gospel. It was a lot of practical there you go. Practical charity on Jesus' part, and that's why the Pharisees hated him. The parable of the prodigal son was part of three parables that Jesus was sharing with the sinners, the prostitutes, the tax collectors who he was dining with, because Pharisees were like in the background, sniggering, having a go, WTF. So the gospel is real life, like it's happening right now.
How do you navigate being a political conservative and being transgender? Because it seems like they're against the whole thing.
So it's important for us to philosophically define in a sound way what is conservatism.
Yeah, what is it?
I won't bore you with Edmund Burke's conservatism. So
what are your core beliefs as a conservative? How about that? Your core beliefs as a conservative.
I think it would be reasonable to say that a conservative is walking along. He or she is head up, looking forward, but they turn around. They every now and then they stop, they stand still, they turn around, see what's behind them, as in the past, see what their ancestors have laid down for them, why their ancestors have laid down for them, why I'm not Jewish, I'm not ethnically appropriating here, why my Jewish spiritual ancestors, as per the Old Testament, why they've laid all these stories, all these Psalms, etc., in the Old Testament. A conservative looks back to the past to think about what it means for the present so that they can walk forward again prudently. And that way when they're walking forward, they're not tripping over, they're not doing silly things of any sort, eyes wide open because they looked behind, they thought about what it means for the present, and then they walked forward. That's conservative. So, and have I applied that as a trans woman? I think I have. As I said earlier, there are some children, I was a child once, who would greatly benefit, who would have, and some now would greatly benefit from puberty blockers. It's just a matter of how do we figure them out, and that's not one of the two lazy approaches I talked about earlier. That's difficult.
Okay.
And if we're going to politicize being transgender, well, we won't be able to find solutions, hard solutions, very difficult to find solutions to these very difficult problems.
It
So
is
here we are.
so political, though, right? Today, it is highly politicized. I suppose I want to ask, between the feminists and the trans rights activists, right? It's this like political battle. I'm interested, like, how would you like to see that discussion sort of progress, or how could you see it progressing? Because it seems to be very polarizing at the moment.
In the ideal world, you wouldn't have activists. You would have real trans people. You would have women. So when I say cisgender, it's not meant to be a slur. So there's a misconception that it's a slur. But I mean, if you look at some of the things Posey Parker say, it's like, well, if I can let her get away with that, I should be allowed to use a term like cisgender. But anyway, so trans women who you can tell that either they're transitioning or if they're finished transitioning. Not that they look like a bloke. They've put no effort in and they've just done self-ID. No, forget about that. Like that's a distraction. Genuine trans women and cisgender women with concerns, they're at a table. Yes, it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but they just have to talk to each other. Because talking to each other through social media, whether it's having internet battles on the internet battles or watching Posey Parker, etc., people on one's own side online to engage in confirmation bias, that's not a conversation. A conversation is walking away from your laptop, putting away your mobile phones, dumb phones, and having face-to-face conversations. But it's pretty difficult in a digital world to do any of that. I have tried to have those conversations face-to-face at the Posey Parker events I went to.
And you're counter-protesting?
Correct.
Yes. Okay. Hey, I've noticed you've defended women's rights activists before. You've defended them. What about their position do you agree with?
When they're reasonable, when there's an acknowledgement of, yes, there are trans women who do pass because they look like women, and there doesn't seem like anything we can do about that, and it just is, or they're not a concern. It was never about them to begin with. That level of reasonableness. So it's not necessarily the political positions taken, it's how it's communicated. We go back to the example earlier about my position on abortion. It's not my position, it's how I communicate with those in difficult situations. It's the same principle. And so the gender critical feminists that I will defend are the ones who I can see they've put in some effort to try to be nuanced. They should at least get some credit for that.
Right. Okay. And what about you have in your Twitter bio, you've got pronouns who/cares.
Ah, right. So
talk to me about the pronouns.
I've got to show how unwoke I am. I mean, you could argue that I'm woke in that I've transitioned genders and that I think it's okay for certain trans children in certain circumstances to be on puberty blockers. An argument could be made I'm woke. Well, I've got to show how unwoke I am and, balance it out. Just counter-protesting against myself. I hate the display of pronouns. If someone can't figure out by now that my pronouns are she, her, I'm not sure they're a rational person I want to have deep conversations with. I see look, unless you're non-binary, and it's not obvious that you're non-binary, or you're early in your transition or whatever, those certain circumstances where having pronouns make complete sense, fair. But if someone can't figure out what my pronouns here is by now, or do the whole, and I've had this before, no, I don't know what your pronouns are. Do you mind if I ask? It's like, well, hang on. I've been through a medical transition. Yes, it may seem like I'm being stereotypical in my dress, etc., but stereotypes and generalizations have their limitations, but there are some truths to it. It's not completely true, but there is some truth to it. It may mean something, and maybe, it should be that obvious that my pronouns are she. So,
you and me both. I mean, I don't like being asked my pronouns, but anyway.
Who/cares? And Melody, if you don't use my pronouns, who/cares, you're a bigot.
All right. Why don't we end with this? How should we engage or try to engage in having open discussions with people we disagree with? How do we do that aside from counter protesting? As
I said earlier, meet people in real life. If you can't, and it can only be on the internet, I've had some success with someone reaches out to me on Facebook Messenger, for example, or I reach out to them, and I think carefully about the words I use. They say that written communication is like 10 or 20% of communication. So I choose my words very carefully. I think about how could my words be read at the other end, like if I was me, like putting myself in their shoes, and show that I've actually thought about their perspective. Don't ram a whole bunch of links at them. Don't ram a whole bunch of copy pasta. It's not going to be appreciated. They can tell if this is going to be done over the internet. It's a way of showing that you're listening, even though you're not face to face. Anyway, in real life, preferably in real life, you would let someone say everything they need to say so that they can get it off their chest. And once they're done with saying what they wanted to say, they've let off steam. They're probably in a better place to then engage in a more rational conversation about a controversial issue. And then you work from there. It's kind of, I've never had children. I've never parented. But if you look at the way parents and young children have to work with each other, it's a lot of hard work. The parent has to, without resorting to, whacking them with a ruler or however it's done in earlier days, the modern parent has had to figure out how to, parent without resorting to corporal punishment. That's not easy. So I'm not saying be condescending, but there are some things to be learned from parenting young children, because the parent has to get the child to develop and grow without whacking them with a ruler, and they eventually make it happen anyway. And I think there are lessons to be learned there. It's not that different, without being condescending.
Let people talk and listen. I like that. I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me.
Mm-hmm. It's been a pleasure.
All right. I'll see you later.
See you later.